Hi, I'm Crispin. I'm a PM on the UAC team, and I'm going to talk to you today about developing for the standard user. This is an outline of the talk. Start with some discussion about the purpose of UAC. No, it's not there to annoy people. The state of UAC, because it's all about moving the application ecosystem from where it was in XP days to where we want it to be. And then the technical stuff of how to develop to facilitate that and enhance security and enhance the value of your products. I'm kind of an architect, so there were going to be demos, but it's not working. There won't be pictures of APIs and code and stuff. You can read the manuals better than I can read them to you. So the ultimate goal of UAC is to encourage everyone, to enable everyone to run as a standard user. Why? Well, the security. If you're running an application as a standard user and it's vulnerable, that doesn't mean instantly vulnerable machine. TCO, users who are running as standard user find it much more difficult to break their machine if they're an enterprise workstation. Manageability. Your users can't violate your enterprise policy if they're a standard user. If they're a local admin, policy, schmolicy, we can do whatever we want. And then how do we get there? Well, that's simple. Just change every Windows application. Okay. Changing that many applications all at once is kind of problematic. If you spent your entire life running around barefoot and someone hands you some hiking boots, they're not going to be so comfortable, even though we're heading for the parking lot with the broken glass, and you're going to need them anyway. And that's kind of where we are in UAC, that we handed out the hiking boots a couple of years ago, and people are starting to get used to it. UAC is a transitional technology. It's a softer, gentler flavor of standard user. There's lots of legacy applications that will break horribly under standard user that actually work under UAC. That's what it's for, is so that things that... Ooh. So kinds of users in Vista and in Win 7. The classic administrator is no longer your default account. Now it's the administrator approval mode. That's the default account type that you get when you create a user. More secure is the standard user. And this is what we really want you to aim at. You'll hear that a few times today. Windows 7 has UAC, as Stephen showed us this morning. Anybody not see the keynote this morning? A few. So I'm not going to bother with the petite demo. That amounts to showing you the slider. So the good thing for users is that UAC is now, the UAC setting is now easily accessible to you. So as a dev for your personal machine, you no longer have to turn UAC off to get your work done. You can just use the slider. If the prompt is annoying you right now because you're doing compile, edit, hack loops, then turn it down. And when you're done, turn it back up, especially if you're going to go browsing the internet. On the other hand, as a dev for your target, we really, really want you to ignore the slider and aim at standard user. Don't make any assumptions about what position the user has the slider in. In fact, we want you to assume that the slider is popped right off the top of the slider and is up here at standard user land. The state of the ecosystem. So where are we? Why does UAC prompt? Well, because everything used to run as administrator. And programmers, I'm a programmer, I'm a lazy butt too. You do the most expedient thing necessary to get where you want to go. And for most of the life of Windows, administrator was available to you, and so people would just use that capability whenever they felt like it. And as a result, a lot of legacy applications are not kind to the standard user. This is true for both Microsoft devs and third-party devs. And that's the trick, is to move this market. This is sort of a graphical view of what's going on. The big circle is stuff that an administrator can do. The smaller circle is a subset. These are things that a standard user can do. These are things that real users need to do. And that's what UAC is there for, is to allow you to elevate to do those necessary things, while highlighting that they are privileged operations, that you don't really want malware or stuff doing to you. Some of them are necessary, like installing software. It would really not be cool if someone installed software on your box without asking you. Some of them are not so necessary. Applications tromping on registry keys for HKLM when they don't need to. Changing the time zone. That's a change that I think Vista made, that it used to be privileged to touch the time, and now you can change the time zone all you want. Changing the time remains privileged because that actually matters for like FTC-controlled organizations where, did Martha Stewart know about the stuff before she traded the stock or not? I'm not saying. I'm not alert. Okay, Martha, give it back. Some myth busting. How many prompts are there? Everybody knows that everyone disables UAC, right? We all tell each other that. And that Windows prompts too much. It's terrible. How much of this is myth and how much is reality? Our customer reporting data is that 88% of users have UAC turned on. So it's just not true that everyone disables UAC. 12% turning it off. Okay, that's a sizable chunk. There's a bunch of annoyed users. We have work to do. But the vast majority of your customers are UAC turned on. So if your strategy is to wait for UAC to go away, you may need Plan B. How many UAC prompts are there? Our data, what we did was abstract it out to measuring sessions. And a session is defined as starting when you log on and going until either you log out or 24 hours has passed. And we're calling that your work day. It's a session. And it's a new session if 24 hours goes by and you're back again. This is prompts per session across a bunch of different platforms. If you can't read the fine print, there's Consumer Vista, Consumer SP1, Enterprise Vista, and Enterprise SP1. The important thing is that the zero case, 0 prompts per session, that's the good one. We want lots there, is the majority all the time. So big lump here in 0 prompts per session. And then a long tail of 1 or 2 and really wee out here at 9. And this hump of 10 or more means there are pathological cases in the data. Another thing to notice is that SP1, the numbers are always better. So there's way more 0 prompt sessions for SP1 than there is for 1 or 2 prompt sessions. And a third thing to notice is that, well, Enterprise did something interesting, because Enterprise had worse performance at RTM and better performance after SP1, which is interesting. This data shows the number of unique applications that are showing up as reporting having caused UAC prompts. And in August of 2007, it was like nearly 800,000. And you get down to August of 2008, and it's below 200,000. So thank you all for improving your applications and making this situation better. So how to do this developer standard user stuff. Fix applications to use privilege correctly. This is a summary slide. I'm going to dig into detail on each of these points. Try to avoid privilege. How to ask for privilege correctly. When you have privilege, be careful with it. And doing all this stuff makes your applications more secure and more valuable. Because when your app has a vulnerability, you're not it for critical vulnerability that's on the front cover of Information Week or something like that. Target the standard user rather than UAC per se. UAC is training wheels. It's a kinder, gentler standard user. It has heuristic hacks in it to try and detect installers. It's trying to detect legacy installers, programs that never heard of UAC because they were written for XP or something. UAC virtualizes, i.e. fakes, system resources like HKLM, so that if you have an application that's writing to HKLM and we don't think it should, we fake it. We lie to the application and say, sure, you can write to HKLM. You're not, but we'll do it anyway. Do not rely on this stuff. If you're writing new code, don't count on it. It's here for legacy, not for new code. It's disabled for 64-bit. If you're grown up and you're writing for 64-bit, we figure that you can target the standard user properly. We don't need the virtualization trickery. So your code is just much more future safe if you just target standard user. Then it will always work. Try to avoid privilege. You don't want it. It induces prompts that annoy the users. It won't work in standard user environments. I get to talk to enterprise customers, big Wall Street banks, drug companies, that sort of thing, and a whole, not all of them, but a bunch of them actually have like tens of thousands of standard user workstations deployed. And if your app doesn't work as a standard user, they are not your customer. They're choosing applications that run as a standard user because it makes their environment more secure. I've said this before, if there's a vuln in your application and you're using privilege, oh, you are such a target. You're the raw meat that attackers are looking for. So if you just avoid privilege, then you don't have to write perfect applications. So think of privilege as cooties. You don't want them. How to stay away. Put a manifest on your program. Visual Studio does this by default. And include a marker for how you want it invoked. As invoker basically means if a standard user ran it, then you would like it to run as standard user. Thank you. You don't put any words like setup or install in your file name. Those will trigger the heuristics that go, oh, you're a legacy installer. I'm going to do some elevation stuff to you. But if you have the manifest marker in there, then the heuristics are turned off. Don't require elevation. Don't go messing with system DLLs. Don't hack system registry keys. Try to do everything to the user and not to the system if you can at all help it. Don't touch the tender bits. How to use privilege. Only get it when you actually need it. There's lots of operations where if you specify generic all rights for some resource that you asked for, that will trigger privilege. But if you just said read only, hey, we'll let you read without privilege, no problem. It's only if you need to change system resources quite often that it will trigger a privileged operation. So if your application might need privilege, then you can build a non-privileged version that does all its non-privileged stuff and then have a button on it with a shield on it that says, do dangerous stuff here. Click the button, and then your application elevates to do the privileged stuff. And so that would mean that most of the time when the user isn't doing the dangerous stuff, they can just run your app with no prompts. But sometimes applications need privilege. You need privilege to do per machine install instead of per user install. You need it to configure devices. You need it to adjust the firewall. If you're a management application, of course you need privilege because privilege is all about management. So there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. Asking for privilege, you can't actually elevate a process. What you can do is create a new one that's elevated. Ideally, you would manifest this new hunk of code with a manifest that says as administrator, and then it will elevate and prompt or whatever whenever you run it. Windows can also infer that you're an installer because of those heuristics with the file names. And I'm going to go into some detail on these three major ways to get privilege: launching a process, launching a COM object, and using a task or a service. Launching a process. You could launch a privileged instance of yourself. This is what Task Manager does. If you fire up Task Manager and you click on View All Processes, the Task Manager window will briefly close and then reopen. what it did was launch a privileged copy of itself and then kill the old one. And the privileged version can see all the processes, and the non-privileged version couldn't. So this is kind of bad because it interrupts the user experience. The window goes away and comes back. Hey, what happened? Oh, I guess it's all right. And it's bad in that everything that your application does from now on is privileged. So all those bad things about privilege, they now apply to you. And it's good in that it's simple. You don't have to think too hard about this. You just do it. And everything is privileged from now on, so you don't have to worry about getting privilege anymore. COM object is a somewhat different way to do it. You call co-create as admin to get a COM object that will do your dirty work for you. So this is an out-of-proc COM object, and it runs elevated, and you don't. And then you have a chat with it over RPC, and it does privileged things for you. So this is good in that it lets you factor the privileged stuff into the COM object over there. Not so good in that there are subtle, evil ways to do it badly. So this is the bad idiom, and the good idiom is coming up. The non-privileged application creates the privileged COM object, and then the non-privileged application has a GUI that's non-privileged on the desktop, and the user clicks things, and it sends messages to the COM object, which does them. The problem is that the non-privileged process is a vulnerable stooge. In academic theory, we call it the confused deputy. Because it's non-privileged, malware can drive it to do darn near anything, and does. Force the non-privileged application to send bogus messages to the COM object, which it goes, oh, George said that I should do this. I guess I'll go format drive C. So there's the cartoon view. Your low application has a high COM object, and the malware is pushing the low application. It's effectively pushing buttons on your GUI for you. Doing it correctly, your non-privileged process wants to do the privileged thing, and so you create the privileged COM object, and the COM object itself should draw the GUI. Now the GUI is running high, which means that it's protected by a Windows feature called UIPI. And that means that applications that are not privileged don't get to send it messages. They can't even see it. So now the privileged stuff is all on Privileged Island where the bad guys can't get to it. This is a way that you can have a privileged part of your application factored out and keep it safe. And this is the cartoon view of what's going on here. The low app creates the COM object that creates the privileged GUI, and the malware tries to touch the buttons on the privileged GUI, and it just doesn't work. Can't get there. And there was going to be a demo, but it decided to not work right now. Basically showed that I've got a COM object and malware that tries to click the buttons, and it worked last week, and it won't click the buttons now. Sorry. Another method would be that you can use a task or a service. Your installer would create the task or service that's sitting around there all the time waiting to be of service. You send it requests from your unprivileged application, and it goes and does the administrative things for you. The difference between a task and a service is that tasks are on demand. When you ask for them, they come into existence, and they live for a while, and then they kill themselves. Service is around all the time. The other difference is that tasks are in Vista and Win 7, and services work downrev. They work in XP. So tasks are generally better, more technically superior, and services are more marketable because it works on that XP stuff. The bad thing about services and tasks is that it expands your attack surface. Because your task or service is now a target. Bad guys can go, oh, look, he has that installed. Yeah, let's play with the service. Tasks and services cannot have GUIs. So that pathology I was talking about before, Now that has to be the case. If you have a non-privileged GUI on the desktop, users click buttons, that turns into messages to the task or the service. So now the task or service has to be very careful. It has to assume that every message it gets came from malware, because you can't tell whether it did or not. Another problem is excessive prompting. This is the pathological case, where if you have a program that bops in and out of privileged land, every time it does, you get a prompt. So you can reduce this multiple prompting effect by refactoring your installer or your application so that you create the privilege process and keep it around. Just because it's done for now, don't kill it, leave it there. You may need it again later. Windows File Explorer made this mistake. If you tried to create, I think it was either a folder or a file underneath a folder that was privileged, then it would ask you multiple times with prompts. And that was fixed in Vista SP1. Test as a standard user. This is the big hammer message of this talk, is don't just test under UAC with the slider in any position, but actually create yourself another login account that's not an administrator and test your app there. This ensures that your app will work as a standard user, because, as I said, UAC is an approximation to that. How to care for privilege. Install for the requesting user. This is a very common pathology. If you install for the current user, if the user happened to be a standard user, and they therefore had an OTS prompt, over-the-shoulder prompt, that's like a UAC elevation, but it asks for your password instead of just yes, no. And the thing with the OTS prompt is that it's not just messing with the security token to make you suddenly more privileged. It's doing a full-on user change. So it changes from user Bob to administrator, and then runs your code. So the current user is no longer Bob. So if your installer then goes and configures a bunch of stuff, create your music player files, your all that per user stuff, it did it to the administrator account instead of Bob's account. So the best way to get around this is don't configure at all during install. Configure on first run instead. Do all the per user stuff every time some user runs your app for the first time. If for some reason you couldn't do that, then the installer needs to remember that Bob asked for this. And so when it's running as administrator, it goes back and messes with Bob's account instead of the administrator's account. That's hard work. So just configure on first run. Don't launch an elevated application. Lots of installers are very helpful, and as soon as they're done installing, they either offer to launch or actually launch the first instance of the app. Now, if Bob, the standard user, did this and he did the OTS elevation, that first instance runs as administrator, and there's all those music files that you configured for him, and he uses the application, and it works, and he's happy, and he logs out, and he goes home, and he comes back the next day, starts your application, and there's no music. Where'd it go? It's over there in the administrator's account, but Bob doesn't know that. Bob didn't see this talk. So really don't do that. There's a related problem that if you start up a help file, you open readme.htm, you just started IE as administrator. And Bob doesn't know that either, so he reads the README file and then goes, oh, I wonder what's going on over on ABC News. And now Bob's browsing the web as administrator. Don't do that. So solution, keep your initial non-administrator process around and go back to use it. Or, like I said, best path is don't do any configuring at all in your installer. Do it on first run. And you need one little process hanging back. So, okay, Bob called for install. magic happened over in administrator land, and the thing that Bob started is sitting there waiting. Are you done? Oh, good. Now it launches an instance of the application. Another fine point, don't attempt to downgrade privilege. If you have a privileged process, don't try and downgrade it. Just exit. Keep the non-privileged processes around if you need them. If you need privilege, if you got privilege, you are now part of the trusted computing base. With great power comes great responsibility. Treat all input as if it's potentially from a malicious source. You are the gold standard target. Now everyone is trying to scam you. It's like all the Nigerian 419ers in the world are gunning for you. Check all your parameters, every one of them. Don't assume anything is a good piece of data. And don't use a deny list of characters that you can't process. Use an allow list of characters that you can process. Everyone who's ever used a deny list has regretted it. Trust me. If your privileged code takes input from non-privileged code, you have to treat it as a suggestion. That's an important way to think about it. Those aren't commands coming from Bob, the non-privileged user. Those are suggestions. And you have to subject every one of them to your security policy of, is it okay to do this? So that's not necessary if you use the elevated COM object with the elevated GUI. But it absolutely is necessary if you're using the task or the service approach. And similarly, it's absolutely necessary if you're using the elevated COM object and the non-elevated GUI. This is what Howard and LeBlanc's book calls crossing a trust boundary. The privileged bit has goodies that the non-privileged attacker wants. And he'll try and get them from you by trickery, sending creative inputs that look legitimate but aren't. This is another trust boundary. In this case, it's the trust boundary between the World Wide Web out there, the web server, and the back-end database. This is an amusing rendition of what's going on in an SQL injection. So to summarize, the least privilege model that Vista introduced, it's good. It's good for the platform security. It's good for your security. It saves us all from our own flawed software, because if everybody's running everything as administrator, then the security requirement is basically don't write vulnerable code. And writing perfect code all the time is really tedious. High privilege is dangerous. Use it as little as possible. Use it correctly. Think of high privilege as cooties. Avoid using high privilege. Mark your stuff as invoker so that we don't accidentally try and elevate you. Don't touch the tender bits so that we don't demand that you run elevated. Ask for privilege correctly. You can use an elevated process, an elevated COM object, an elevated task, or an elevated service. And in all cases, except the elevated COM object with the elevated GUI, you have to treat all your inputs as untrusted, defensive programming. And above all, test as a standard user. Please fill out the evaluation forms that you get your vote on whether you want to see me back here or not. Question period. I like to leave this slide up so that you can write down the long and complicated URLs. And I will, if you want, I can try and show you the broken demo of the thing not quite working. It might be illustrative if people are interested. And I see we have a question.
Hello. A couple comments. You talked about elevated out-of-process COM objects. One of the things we do is we want to have a very fine-grained attack surface there. So instead of writing like a method that's write to any registry key in HKLM, if you know you're going to write to a specific one, your app needs to do that. Just hard code what that key is in your COM object, and that.
Excellent
again,
idea. Yeah, you've reduced your attack surface that way.
So for those of us who are good Vista citizens and did UAC and moved all your admin stuff out into out-of-process COM objects, you mentioned that in Windows 7, you're reducing the number of things that actually require elevation. So how do we find out about those and whether it impacts things we're currently elevating for today?
I don't have a handy list of everything.
I assume HKLM is still off limits, obviously.
Yeah, HKLM is still off limits. The number one thing that's popular with users is Windows Update is no longer privileged.
Okay.
DPI is now a per-user setting, so you don't need privilege to change the DPI on your screen. We're working on some stuff that I have to be vague about because I'm not allowed to promise anything.
I guess the easiest thing to do is things that you're elevating for now, if you're not sure, test them on Windows 7 and see if you need elevation anymore.
That would be a pretty reliable way to do it, yes. Okay. Not promising, but I would expect that it's monotonic, that the pre-beta that you have might still be demanding privilege for things that we depriv later because it's work to do that.
A major PC manufacturer whose name will be nameless recently changed its system update utility so that it no longer gives UAC prompts but instead operates as standard user by essentially drilling a hole through to a service and using a not-so-secret token to guard those transactions. So my question is, do you run a snitch line?
Sure, there it is. If you have an issue, you can mail me, and I'll try and track down who we should talk to. The not-so-secret token, of course, sounds vulnerable.
It's readable out of Task Manager if you turn on privilege in Task Manager.
But we deprived update because...
Oh, no, it's not you.
No, but we did. So who cares if update is non-privileged? Who cares if the attacker can update stuff?
This is a generalized backdoor anybody could use to do anything.
Oh,
I can explain it to you.
Not so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but in terms of snitching to Microsoft, it seems more effective than actually going after individual software vendors who may or may not care.
Well, like, all that's going to happen is that I'm going to turn around and find some industry relation person to go after them instead of you.
Yeah, but is that a good idea?
Well, probably both is a good idea because if we go and harass them, they'll just tell us that their customers like it this way.
Thank you.
Hey, I saw something a couple weeks ago. I think it might have been something that Norton put out. That was there was a UAC replacement tool, and what it did is add a little checkbox to the UAC dialog that says, "Don't ask me again for this application." It seemed like a really, really good idea because every time I launch Visual Studio 2005, you have to run as administrator. So, is that an option that Microsoft's looking at picking up in Windows 7?
That is the number one ask for UAC, but it's hard to do correctly. In Unix, the feature is called setuid. Oh, a little bio. I was a Linux guy until January. I was previously the security architect for SUSE Linux.
Okay, you can hardly see the scars.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt at all when they install the laser. setuid has a long history of bad vulnerabilities. Not that the feature is fundamentally defective, but it's a very pointy knife, and it's got points on both ends. So it's really easy to hurt yourself with it. And so we're very concerned about adding this kind of feature and not getting it right. Okay. And the Norton product is one of 4 that I know of that effectively do the remember me thing of don't prompt me for this application again.
Okay. That's all right. If you guys don't think you can figure it out, that's fine.
I didn't say that. I'm just not promising we can. But the Norton product works only for administrator approval mode. It doesn't work for a standard user. Conversely, the product from Beyond Trust only works as a standard user and doesn't help administrator approval mode.
It's a little bit optimistic question, really, but is there any options for delivering a seamless GUI that still has elevated and non-elevated parts? In other words, not having to rely on a separate window or dialog?
No.
No.
Because that's the granularity of protection that UIPI protects is a window. So if the window is high, all of it is high. And if the window is low, all of it is low. And if you mix it up, then the attacker can do privileged things.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question. And does the behavior of the UI access true or not of manifest change at the Windows 7?
The behavior of existing manifests has not changed. We added a new one, but one of the requirements of the new one is be signed by the Windows key, so you can't use it. Or rather, the bad guys can't use it, which is the point.
We have an application that copies files to a user-selected folder. And my question is, how can we detect when we need elevation in order to succeed copying the files?
You'll get an error code if you try and copy them and it doesn't allow it.
Well, it's access denied, but it could be that the current user is not allowed to access this folder. How can we make the difference?
What is the difference? If the current user doesn't have permission, they don't have permission.
Well, if he gets elevation, he might be allowed.
If he can elevate, then he's definitely allowed. I don't understand the distinction.
No, my question is how make the difference why the user was denied access to the folder? Because he was not elevated or because he doesn't have permission to write to this folder in general?
There is no difference.
So how the Windows Explorer will decide whether to prompt for elevation or just give access denied?
There are some folders where even if you're elevated, you don't have permission. But an elevated process does have permission to change the ACLs on the folder so that you do have permission. And I think that Windows Explorer does some tricky stuff, like if you force it and say, no, I really want access to this folder, what it does is change the ACLs, give you access, and then change them back.
So how can we do this from our application?
You
cannot if you want to be certified to do that.
Pardon me?
You cannot change, you must not change the ACLs if you want to certify the program.
Perhaps we should take this offline because your question sounds complicated, and my gut says you shouldn't be doing that, but it's complicated, so I want to give you a detailed answer.
Okay, basically I have a two-part question. First part is, after years of doing willy-nilly programming access to the entire machine, we think we got rid of most, privileged access within our application. But is there a list somewhere we can double-check everything besides just constant testing on standard user? The basic things, HKLM, don't write to program files directory, things like that we've got handled. But is there anything else we may have missed?
There are two tools that you can use. The official Microsoft-supported one is called SUA, Standard User Analyzer. That's part of the Application Compatibility Toolkit, ACT. And it basically installs some stuff, and then you run your application, and SUA watches your application run and flags it every time it does something privileged and says, hey, you either need to fix or shim this. And SUA is cool in that it will automatically generate the shims for things that it understands. So if you have some legacy code and you run it under SUA, it will actually emit stuff that you can just install around your app and it will work. On the other hand, SUA is incomplete. It doesn't flag everything. There's another tool called Lua Buglight, which is not Microsoft supported, but it is freeware, and it was written by a Microsoft guy, Aaron Margosis, and so you get it from his blog. Buglight does not have the I will automatically generate shim stuff for you, but it does have a more comprehensive and detailed analyzer, so it flags more stuff. It understands more of the privileged things that your program might be doing.
Still, the problem with that is basic code coverage. If you'd have to run it over and over and over again until you make sure you hit every little line.
The problem is, Turing complete. We can't tell what your application is going to do until it does it.
Second part, access to the common app directory. Is that basically a standard user access to just common app data.
You mean program files?
No. Program data / my company name / my product name, whatever. Yeah, documents and settings. I mean, that area.
If it's in the user's Hive, it's not privileged, and if it's not in the user's Hive, it should be privileged. And
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, there is per
It's okay.
Win7's one of the things it supports is per user program installs. And I don't think you even need Win7. Like Google Chrome does a per user program install, which is cool because it doesn't prompt you at all when you install Chrome. And less than cool in that malware that wants to go and mess with the Google Chrome program files and worm them can go right ahead. Maybe that prompt was worth it. And the other problem with per user installs is that it's not corporate manageable. So enterprise IT can't see that you have Chrome installed, and so they can't manage it. And some organizations regard that as a problem.
Yeah, I don't see a solution to that at all. You're basically moving everything from program files directory to a per user directory, making it bigger because now it's per user, and it doesn't change the problem. I don't see how we're going to fix that at all.
I'm not a big fan of per user install, but other people in Microsoft are.
It's almost, I think in this day and age, it's almost impossible to get a per user install that really does anything to work. Because if you even to register a file, you have to have currently. My understanding is there's going to be some solution to that concept as well, but I don't know the details of it. But it's, anything but a trivial install is probably going to require a distribution, which is just to do what it has to do, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Maybe the times are changing on that, but our data, I have not seen virtually any per user installs for any kind of real, like a normal app other than maybe like Screensaver or something like that.
Yeah. When I think about per user installs, all I see is problems, but other people like it.
I mean, there is the app data folders and all that, but a lot of people want to install a program file for the same reason you said, is that security reasons, you kind of want your stuff there. But and also the stuff under the per user folder can be a little hard, tricky to find in some cases, especially because you don't have privileges usually to find it unless you're that user.
So is there a model for doing standard user security that still deals with like XP in 2003 and Vista and Win7, or is it all kind of
Absolutely.
You got to go down one path and then switch?
You can run on XP as a standard user, and that's where some of this stuff got its start. The Air Force mandated that all of their workstations will be run as standard user. They're the Air Force. They have some security issues. And they actually achieved this. They run like 500,000 XP machines with their users as standard user. It's not fun. You don't get to install Yahoo Instant Messenger at the drop of a hat. But dang if it ain't secure. So if you make your program work for standard user on XP, it'll work for standard user on Vista and on 7.
But there's no way to incorporate any like the elevation stuff. I mean, if you know in advance that you're going to have system level settings.
Well, that's the difference between Vista and on and XP and behind, is that Vista has this elevation feature so that you can elevate from non-privilege to privilege in the middle of doing something. And XP simply doesn't have that. If you need privilege in XP, well, you either have to log out or fuss to a different user and then do your work. I think he's next.
If you have a service that was affected by session zero isolation, now you're breaking into a service and an app, client or a user app. What are your options to communicate? Is there just sockets and name pipes, or is there some other method you can use?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think we did some funny business with session zero, so session zero no longer means what you think it means. Services should not have GUIs, and we don't allow them to have GUIs. So you end up using that non-privileged GUI to talk to the privileged service, and so you have to have a trust barrier at the service.
Okay.
Well, my recommendation is that the service should treat everything that's coming in from non-privileged land as a suggestion. It's scary. Malware out there, the user got himself infected with something, and now is sending your privileged services messages that say interesting things. You just have to use defensive programming. And if you can't do that, if the things that your app needs to do are so powerful that there's no way that you can apply policy to say whether it's okay or not, then I think you really have to use the elevated COM object and elevated GUI or a full elevated process to do your work, and you're going to get prompted. And you should get prompted because your operations are apparently so powerful that there's no way to trust that they're right.
I have a couple of questions. On that last question, I was going to add that one of the things you never assume that because you have a manifest, you have administrator privileges, because as you mentioned, downgrade on earlier platforms, that doesn't guarantee you anything. So a good installer or app will always check to see if it's an administrator and let you know whether or not it is, or whether you have that privilege so that it works on previous platforms. Because unfortunately, some people do rely on the manifest to assume that that gives them administrator privileges, and it does not.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple of questions. One of you mentioned that when you switch privileges, you switch to a totally different account, which is kind of a serious problem in a lot of different ways. Some that come to mind is that network drives that are mapped no longer appear for the other user, which is kind of unfortunate, and most people consider it a bug.
Yeah, the semantics there are tricky. The network drive mappings are per user, so if you change user, they go away.
Yeah, it's typically you usually see the problem in a DOS application, because usually a DOS application has to be run as administrator, but unfortunately, running regular Explorer as an administrator is tricky. I think, if I remember correctly,
Windows Explorer tries really hard to not let you run as an administrator because it has too many plugins, so it can't be trusted.
I believe there is a way to do it, but I don't remember.
There is a way to. I've seen it done, but the Explorer people are trying hard to protect you from yourself.
And then, of course, if you do that, obviously anything you run from Explorer will be run as an administrator at that point. So it's a cascading.
Yes, and so will all your plugins. Yeah. Can you say file previewer?
Oh, okay. So another problem related to that is that you switch HKey current users at that point.
Yes.
And you don't have access anymore, or you usually can't even figure out you may not be able to figure out what the other HKey current user was. You mentioned that installers should keep track of who actually launched it.
That's sort of a backup plan. The best plan is to do per user configuration on first run rather than at install time.
I don't know how you could make that work, because not only can you not, even if you could figure out what the HKey current user hive is for that other user, you probably wouldn't have privileges to change it anyway.
The administrator doesn't have privileges to change HKCU for Bob? Say what?
Probably. I don't know if it depends on obviously how they set it up, but maybe not, depending on how this. I don't know. I'm not sure, quite honestly.
Maybe for network access if Bob is domain joined, but for local stuff, local admin can mess with Bob all at once.
Assuming it can actually figure out where that HKey current user hive is.
Yeah.
Tempter is another issue too, because usually users have separate tempters, so it can be difficult, if not impossible.
So this is just a really bad plan. Do your per user stuff on first run.
Right, I agree with you. Unfortunately, I don't write installs. I just write tools to make install, or we just write tools to make installs. So, the other question is, one of the problems with UAC is that apps running in the browser don't support manifests or UAC prompts. So if you're running the browser as a standard user, and your browser-based app needs to be an administrator, you're kind of in trouble at that point. So I don't know what the plan is. I don't know if there's any plan to do anything about that, but that broke just about every IE-based installer that's out there in previous versions that needed administrator privileges. No longer works now, nor does it prompt for anything. It just runs as a standard user and then fails.
Yeah, I'd sort of consider that a good thing, considering the amount of web vulnerability out there. Do you really want a direct path from the World Wide Web, the buffer overflow in your JPEG interpreter, and your administrator account?
I agree with you, but unfortunately, people who have existing Windows existing installers may not agree with you. I don't know. Another quick question. You mentioned I know that the UAC prompt comes up on the secure desktop, or what's referred to as a secure desktop, so it can't be changed or whatever.
Yep.
Or so that apps that like to try to push buttons for you can't do it. I was wondering if you had any data on whether people are disabling that frequently. I know there's a way to disable that and make it come up on the regular desktop. Maybe most people don't know about that feature, but
that's one of the positions on the slider in Win 7. Oh, wait.
I guess people change it. They don't particularly. A lot of people think that secure desktop's a little kludgy.
There's a good reason for it. Anyway, go away. This is where the change UAC stuff is. These are the 4 positions. The top one is Vista behavior. The next one down is Vista behavior without the secure desktop. So if that's what you want, there it is. And I refer to this as my video driver is broken mode, because my machine, the video drivers work just fine, and the secure desktop switch happens in a second. I've seen other people's workstations that have some kind of video driver that's less fortunate, and it'll spend 30 seconds on the black screen before it switches over. And that's not a resource thing. It's not that it takes 30 seconds to change your screen. It's broken. But video's like that. So if it's so inconvenient to you, put the slider there. But when you do that, you make yourself vulnerable to a class of attacks involving spoofing screen prompts. The secure desktop is there for a security reason, and the slider is there for user in control. Now you can have as much or as little security/nuisance as you want.
Yeah, also, you mentioned that there's apps that put checkboxes in the. I'm sorry, I wasted too much time, but there's apps that put checkboxes in the UAC prompt. How do they get away with the
apps that do what now?
Allow a checkbox in the UAC prompt or whatever. Don't prompt me again after this. Are they using their own custom dialogue?
They use a variety of methods, but basically they're hacking the operating system when they install it.
Oh, okay.
Their installer definitely requires privilege. You say yes to privilege once, and now they own your box and does whatever it wants.
So, last quick question. You mentioned that it's easy to launch a new app as a user, but unfortunately you have to use shell execute for that, which doesn't work nearly as well as create process in certain cases. Is there any plans to make create process support UAC at some point? Because typically, obviously, if you're a low privilege app and you call create process, it will fail with I think it's access denied or something like that. So shell execute is not nearly as strong as create process in a lot of ways.
Okay. Do you understand his question?
I'm sorry, maybe that's a little too technical.
Yeah.
Sorry.
How about you?
Yeah, are there new APIs with Windows 7 relative to UAC?
No.
No. Okay. And
which is why the talk is so boring and non-technical.
Yeah.
There's no API information here because none of it has changed.
Okay. You alluded to we could look it up on MSDN, but I was just wondering if there's anything worth looking up. Is there UI guideline changes with respect to when to display the shield icon and when not to?
I think there's a new shield.
A new shield?
Yeah.
Not that one?
What? It's not in the... Okay, so...
Whatever, okay. And then is there a managed API for like equivalent to the COM run except besides just process start?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So you want to, if you're in a .NET application, the most straightforward way to launch another process elevated is just start process or...
how to launch elevated stuff out of .NET?
Yeah, I mean, is there...
I'm pretty sure it can be done, but I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, okay. All right. All right, thanks.
Are we about to run out of time? All right, so I have to wrap it up. Thank you all.